Before we begin tonight, imagine this. You have survived a shipwreck. You've made it to the bare scrap of land in an endless sea. The worst, you think, is behind you. It wasn't. Because on that tiny island, while they waited for rescue, a small group of men decided they would rather rule over the dead than share a boat with the living. The story of Batavia is not really a story about the sea. It's a story about what people become when no one is watching and no help is coming. So settle in, let the world go quiet, and drift with me through one of the strangest, darkest voyages ever recorded. This is Lost Voyage.
In a quiet gallery in the port city of Fremantle, on the western coast of Australia, there stands a doorway that leads nowhere. It is made of pale sandstone, carved in the Netherlands 4 centuries ago, and it was never meant to be here. The blocks were cut and dressed in a Dutch workshop, numbered piece by piece, and loaded into the hold of a brand new ship as ballast, destined to become the gateway of a fortress on the far side of the world. The ship that carried them never arrived. The stones went down with her onto a coral reef in one of the loneliest archipelagos on Earth, and there they lay for more than 300 years, colonized by weed and coral, while the story of the people who had sailed above them passed slowly from horror into rumor into legend, and from legend, very nearly, into silence. Today, the portico stands reassembled under museum light, and visitors walk past it without always understanding what it is. The door of a building that was never built, salvaged from a voyage that became one of the darkest and strangest chapters in the whole long history of the sea. The ship was called the Batavia. She was the pride of the Dutch East India Company, the largest and newest vessel in her fleet, and she sailed from the Netherlands in the autumn of 1628, carrying silver, soldiers, families, and a cargo of human ambition that would prove far more dangerous than any storm. What happened to her, and to the more than 300 people aboard her, unfolded not in a single night of catastrophe, but across months of isolation on a scatter of low coral islands, where the ordinary rules of the world dissolved, and where a small group of survivors discovered that the sea was not the most dangerous thing they had to fear. This is a story of shipwreck, but it is also a story of what human beings become when no one is watching, and of the quiet courage of those who refused to follow. The stones in Fremantle are only the most solid of the story's survivals. In an archive in the Dutch city of The Hague rests the journal of the man who commanded the voyage, its pages filled with courses and soundings, and later with testimony of a kind no commander ever expects to record. In a museum case lies a great carved jewel of banded agate, older than the Roman emperors who once owned it, which crossed the world in the ship's strongroom and outlived nearly everyone who guarded it. On a low island off the Australian coast, walls of stacked coral slabs stand exactly where soldiers piled them 4 centuries ago, the oldest European structure on that whole continent, raised in a single desperate season. And beneath the swell of the Indian Ocean, on a reef named for the hour of the disaster, anchors and cannon lie furred with coral in clear water, marking the place where the finest ship of her age ended her first and only voyage. Each of these things is a fragment of the same night, the same winter, the same handful of human choices, scattered now across the hemispheres the ship was built to join. Gathered back together, they tell a story that the Dutch of the 17th century read with a shudder by candlelight, that Australia counts among the founding legends of its coast, and that historians still turn over carefully, the way one turns over something found on a beach, not entirely sure it is safe to hold. It is a long story, and it deserves to be told slowly, the way the sea itself told it, one tide at a time. Before the voyage begins, a gentle word. If these long, unhurried chronicles of the sea help carry you toward rest, you are warmly invited to subscribe to the channel, so that more lost voyages can find you on other quiet nights. And now, settle in, let your breathing slow, and come back to the beginning. To a shipyard on the cold edge of the Zuiderzee, where the Batavia is still nothing more than a skeleton of oak, and every one of her people is still alive. The Dutch Republic in the 1620s was a small country living an enormous life. A confederation of low, waterlogged provinces that had spent decades fighting free of the Spanish crown. It had somehow, in the space of a single generation, made itself the commercial center of the world. Amsterdam had grown from a modest harbor town into a city of canals and counting houses, where the air smelled of tar and spices and new money, and where the wealth of continents changed hands in rooms overlooking grey water. Ships from every sea crowded its harbor in a forest of masts, herring buses and Baltic grain carriers, whalers back from the Arctic, and towering over them all the East Indiamen, the aristocrats of the waterfront, whose arrival from Java was a civic event. Crowds gathering along the quays to watch the spice fleet warp in. Its very smell, people said, reaching the city before its sails did. At the heart of this transformation stood a single institution, the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, the United East India Company, known to history simply as the VOZ-OC. It was the first great joint stock corporation the world had ever seen, a company with its own fleets, its own armies, its own fortresses, and its own colonial capital on the island of Java, a city the Dutch had named Batavia after the ancient tribe from which they claimed descent. The company existed for one purpose above all others: to control the trade in spices. Nutmeg, mace, cloves, cinnamon, and pepper grew in the islands of the East Indies and almost nowhere else on earth. And in the kitchens and apothecaries of Europe, they were worth many times their weight in silver. A single successful voyage could return profits that seemed almost indecent. But the voyage itself was among the most dangerous undertakings a human being could attempt. The route to the Indies ran south along the whole length of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, and then east across thousands of miles of the Indian Ocean, through waters that were charted only loosely, past coasts that appeared on maps as guesses and dotted lines. Ships left the Netherlands in fleets and returned, when they returned at all, scattered and worn, their crews thinned by scurvy and fever. The company accepted these losses as the cost of doing business. Its directors, the 17 gentlemen who governed it from their chambers in Amsterdam, thought in terms of fleets and decades, not of individual lives. And in the middle years of that decade, they decided that the company needed a new flagship for the autumn fleet of 1628, a vessel larger and finer than any that had gone before, a floating statement of Dutch power. She would be built in the company's own yard in Amsterdam, on an artificial island where the ribs of great ships rose against the sky like the frames of unfinished cathedrals. She would be named for the city she was meant to serve. She would be called Batavia. The Batavia took shape through the seasons of 1627 and 28, and those who watched her grow understood that they were looking at something exceptional. She was built of oak from the forests of Germany and the Baltic, floated down the great rivers in rafts, and seasoned in the company's timber ponds. Her keel ran more than 150 feet, and when her hull was complete, she measured roughly 600 tons, with a high, ornate stern that rose from the water like the facade of a town hall. Dutch shipwrights of that era worked largely without formal plans, carrying the shapes of hulls in their hands and their memories, adjusting by eye as the frames went up, and the men who built the Batavia gave her the characteristic form of the East Indiaman. Broad in the beam to swallow cargo, flat enough in the bottom to cross the shallow Dutch coastal waters, yet strong enough to endure the great southern swells. Her stern was decorated with carved and painted figures, and at her bow rode a carved lion, the emblem of the Dutch Republic, painted red and gold. She carried 3 masts and a towering spread of canvas, and along her sides ran 2 rows of gun ports, for she was armed with more than 20 cast-iron and bronze cannon. An East Indiaman was never only a merchant vessel. She was a warehouse, a fortress, a village, and an instrument of policy, all at once. Below her decks, carpenters framed out the spaces that would hold her life. The great cabin at the stern for her senior officers, the cramped quarters where hundreds of sailors and soldiers would sling themselves at night, the galley with its brick firebox, the hold that would carry trade goods outward and spices home. And deep in that hold, before she ever left the Netherlands, the stevedores lowered in the sandstone blocks of the prefabricated portico 137 pieces of a gateway destined for the citadel of Batavia in Java, stowed low where their weight would steady her in a seaway. Around the stones they packed the rest of her outward cargo, and the most important part of it required an armed escort merely to reach the quay. The Indies trade had one persistent inconvenience. The peoples of Asia had little interest in most European goods. What they wanted was silver, and so every outward-bound fleet carried chests of coin, minted in the Spanish Americas and gathered through the intricate channels of European finance. The Batavia was laden with a fortune in silver coins, packed in iron-bound chests, along with a collection of jewels and curiosities intended for private trade. Among them, a cameo of carved agate so old and fine that it had passed through the collections of emperors, and a quantity of silver plate. It was, by the standards of the day, a treasure of staggering size, and every man who helped stow it aboard understood perfectly well what it was worth. The company understood too, which is why the Batavia would sail with soldiers as well as sailors, and why her chests were locked behind bulkheads in the stern, beneath the cabins of the men entrusted with her command. It is worth pausing for a moment on that word. Trusted. The whole vast machinery of the VOC ran on trust extended across impossible distances. A ship that left the Texel roadstead would be out of all contact with her owners for the better part of a year. Whatever happened aboard her, whatever her officers decided or failed to decide, no message could outrun her. The 17 gentlemen in Amsterdam could write instructions, and they did, in dense and careful volumes. But once the coast of Holland sank below the horizon, an East Indiaman became a small wooden world, answerable mainly to itself. The company tried to manage this danger with a divided command. Authority over the ship as a commercial and political enterprise belonged not to her captain, but to a merchant, the Opperkoopman or upper merchant, a civilian officer who ranked above everyone aboard. The sailing of the ship belonged to the skipper, a professional seaman who knew the ocean but answered in all greater matters to the merchant. It was a structure designed in an office by men who thought in ledgers, and it planted at the top of every ship's hierarchy a seed of resentment. The finest seaman aboard was required to bow to a man who might never have handed a rope in his life. On most voyages, the seed lay dormant. On the Batavia, it would find soil richer than the company could ever have imagined. Her upper merchant was a man named Francisco Pelsaert. He was in his 30s, born in Antwerp, which made him a southerner and a subject of gossip among the northern Dutch. And he had spent years in the company's service in India, where he had shown a genuine gift for trade and diplomacy. He had lived at the Mughal court, learned its languages and customs, written a report on Indian commerce that his superiors admired, and risen on ability rather than birth. He was intelligent, observant, and ambitious, and he was also, as events would prove, a man whose health was uncertain and whose authority rested more on his commission than on any personal force. The skipper was Aryan Jacobs, an experienced seaman from the town of Durgadam, a man of rough manners and considerable skill who had spent much of his life in the company's ships. Pelsaert and Jacobs had met before, in the east, at Surat, and the meeting had gone badly. There had been an evening of drink, an exchange of insults, a public humiliation that Jacobs had neither forgotten nor forgiven. The company, with the whole of its fleet list to choose from, placed these two men at the head of the same ship, the proud merchant above the resentful mariner, and sent them to sea together for the better part of a year. And beneath them both, holding the rank of underkoopman, under merchant, the third officer of the ship in matters of trade, the company placed a newcomer to its service, a former apothecary from the city of Haarlem, a man with a smooth tongue, a graceful manner, and a mind unlike any other aboard. His name was Geronimus Cornelis, and it is around him, in the end, that this whole story turns. Geronimus Cornelis was around 30 years old when he joined the Batavia, and almost everything about his life up to that point had gone wrong. He had trained as an apothecary and set up shop in Haarlem, a respectable trade in a respectable town, but the business had failed. His infant son had died, and there had been whispers around the death, questions about the wet nurse, the kind of quiet scandal that closes doors in a small city. He was pursued by creditors and shadowed by something more dangerous still. Haarlem in those years was unsettled by the case of a painter named Terentius, an artist of remarkable gifts who was accused of holding secret, heretical beliefs, of denying sin itself, of teaching in private gatherings that whatever a man did could not be evil if his heart remained pure, since all things came from God. Terentius was arrested, tried, and broken by the authorities, and the investigation reached toward the circle of men who had known him. Cornelis had known him. Whether the apothecary had truly absorbed the painter's ideas, or merely found in them later a language for something that had always lived inside him, no one can now say. What is certain is that in the autumn of 1628, with his money gone, his reputation curdling, and the shadow of a heresy inquiry at his back, Geronimus Cornelis did what ruined men across the Netherlands did in those years. He went to the East India House and signed on for the Indies. The company asked few questions of its recruits. It needed thousands of men every year to feed its fleets, and it took what came: farm boys and bankrupts, discharged soldiers from the German wars, debtors, dreamers, and the occasional gentleman one step ahead of disgrace. Because Cornelis was literate, well-spoken, and evidently a man of some education, the company made him not a common hand, but an officer of trade, an under-merchant, third in the hierarchy of the finest ship in the fleet. He came aboard the Batavia with a failed life behind him, a persuasive tongue, and a set of private convictions that made ordinary morality look, to him, like a superstition for lesser minds. No one aboard knew any of this. He seemed merely charming. Around these three men gathered the ship's whole company, and it is worth walking slowly through that company, because the Batavia was not a warship crewed by uniform ranks, but a floating cross-section of the Dutch world. She carried, when she sailed, something in the region of 340 souls. The largest group were the sailors, perhaps 180 of them, from ship's boys of 12 or 13 to grey-bearded petty officers, most of them Dutch, but with a scattering of Germans, Scandinavians, and others, for the company hired whoever the ports provided. They worked the ship watch by watch, lived on the gun deck among the cables and the cannon, and were paid wages that most of them had already partly spent before leaving shore. Alongside them travelled soldiers, roughly 100, recruits for the company's garrisons in the east. These were mostly young men, Dutch, German, French, and among them a contingent of French-speaking Walloon and Huguenot soldiers, and they made the voyage in conditions harder than anyone else aboard, confined for much of each day to the airless orlop deck below the waterline, with little to do but endure. Among these soldiers was a young man from the Frisian north named Weber Hayes, a private of no particular distinction, invisible in the muster rolls, whose name the world would one day have cause to remember. And then there were the passengers, because an East Indiaman also served as the company's ferry for its civil establishment. The Batavia carried clerks and assistants for the offices of the Indies, a predicant, a minister of the Reformed Church, named Gijsbert Bastians, travelling out with his wife and their many children to a new congregation, and a number of women and families, wives going to join husbands, servants, a nurse, children of all ages. Among the passengers, one figure stood out, and every account of the voyage lingers on her, because the ship's fate came to coil around her in ways she never chose. Her name was Lucretia Jans, remembered by history as Lucretia van der Meilen after her husband. She was a young woman of Amsterdam, married to a company servant already in the Indies, and she was travelling out to join him, accompanied only by her maid, a young woman named Zwaantje Hendricks. Lucretia was, by the agreement of every witness, strikingly beautiful, and she was gently born, with the manners of the prosperous merchant class, which set her apart and above nearly everyone aboard. On a crowded wooden world with a voyage of 8 or 9 months ahead, her presence was noticed from the first day, by the skipper Ariane Jacobs among others, and what began as notice would sour, in the long months at sea, into something that helped to unmake the ship. In the last days of October in the year 1628, the Batavia dropped down to the fleet anchorage at Texel, the island roadstead where the company's ships gathered to catch a fair wind for the long road south. She lay there among the other vessels of the autumn fleet, 7 or 8 ships, great and small, taking aboard the last of her water, her livestock, her people. Small boats crossed and recrossed the grey water. Letters went ashore. On the 28th or 29th of the month, by the accounts that survive, the wind came fair, the fleet weighed anchor, and the Batavia stood out into the North Sea on the first hours of a voyage from which most of the people aboard her would never return. No one watching from the low Dutch shore that day could have seen anything but a proud new ship beginning a routine passage. The darkness she carried was all below decks, stored as carefully as the silver, and it would take half a year and half a world to come fully into the light. The first weeks of an Indies voyage followed a rhythm that thousands of Dutch seamen knew by heart. The fleet ran south through the Channel, past the chalk headlands of England on one side and the coast of France on the other, and out into the long swells of the Atlantic. The ships kept company when they could, signalling with flags and lanterns, losing one another in weather and finding one another again, and aboard each of them the floating village settled into its routines. The watches turned over to the ringing of the bell. The cooks fed hundreds of mouths twice a day from coppers of barley, peas, and salted meat. The soldiers on the orlop deck learned to endure the darkness and the smell, coming up in small parties for air when the weather allowed. The passengers in the stern found the small occupations that made the days pass: reading, needlework, conversation on the poop deck in fine weather, the education of children who treated the ship as the only world they could remember. The predicant Bastiaens held services on Sundays. His congregation gathered on the main deck with their heads bared to the wind, singing psalms that drifted out over empty water. The fleet called at the Cape Verde Islands or stood past them, crossed the equator with the rough ceremonies sailors have always inflicted on those crossing for the first time, and worked south through the doldrums into the trade winds of the Southern Ocean. And through all those weeks, in the great cabin and on the quarterdeck of the Batavia, the relationships that would decide the fate of everyone aboard were quietly taking their shape. Francisco Pelsayat, the upper merchant, was unwell for long stretches of the passage, confined to his cabin by a recurring fever he had most likely carried home from India. His illness mattered because authority on a crowded ship is a living thing that must be exercised to exist, and for days at a time, the highest authority aboard was a closed cabin door. Into that space moved Ariane Jacobs, the skipper, who commanded the working of the ship in any case, and who had no love whatever for the man above him. And alongside Jacobs, increasingly, moved Geronimus Cornelis, the under-merchant, who had discovered in the skipper a grievance he could work with. The two men were unlike in every outward way, the rough seaman and the smooth apothecary, but they found common ground in resentment and ambition, and in the long idle hours of the tropics they began to talk. What they talked about at first may have been nothing more than complaint, the eternal grumbling of subordinates about a superior. But somewhere in those weeks, the talk began to turn, by degrees so small that perhaps neither man could have named the moment, towards something else. The Batavia carried a fortune in silver. She carried it across an ocean where ships vanished without witness every year. If a ship were to change course in the emptiness south of the Cape, if her officers were to take her not to Java, but to some other destination, to the pirate havens of Madagascar or beyond, the men who held her would hold wealth enough for 100 lifetimes. It was a fantasy that must have flickered through many minds on many treasure ships. What made it different aboard the Batavia was that the two men entertaining it held between them the practical means. Jacobs commanded the sailing of the ship and the loyalty of key men among the crew, and Cornelis possessed a gift which the coming months would reveal in full, for bending other men to purposes they would once have called unthinkable. A mutiny needs more than leaders, and the two began, with great care, to gather followers. A whispered word here, a sounding out there, among the tougher spirits of the crew. The high boatswain, a hard man named Jan Everts, certain of the cadets and young gentlemen sailing in the stern, a handful of soldiers and sailors with little to lose. The circle stayed small, as it had to, for the punishment for even speaking of mutiny was death. And the fleet sailed on, and the ship's ordinary life continued above and around the secret. Dinners in the great cabin, psalms on Sunday, the slow procession of the southern stars rising higher each night. After some months at sea, the fleet reached the Cape of Good Hope, the great replenishing station at the foot of Africa, where the ships anchored in Table Bay beneath the flat mountain and sent their boats ashore for water and fresh meat traded from the Khoikhoi people of the shore. The stay at the Cape should have been a simple interlude. Instead, it produced an incident that history remembers because of everything that followed. Arian Jacobs went drinking, aboard another ship of the fleet and possibly ashore, and drink made him loud and insolent, and his behavior was reported to Pelsiert, who rebuked him, by some accounts publicly and in wounding terms, before other officers. For a proud man already nursing years of grievance, the humiliation went deep. Witnesses later recalled that the skipper's anger after the Cape was of a different quality than before, colder and more settled, and that his conversations with Cornelis grew longer. When the fleet weighed from Table Bay and stood south to catch the westerly winds, the Batavia carried away from Africa everything she needed for what was coming. A sick and isolated commander, a skipper with a wound to his pride, a persuader with a private philosophy that dissolved all guilt, a treasure below decks, and ahead of her, the emptiest ocean on the planet. To understand what happened next, it helps to understand the road the Batavia was traveling, because the road itself was new, and its newness was part of her undoing. For the first decades of the Indies trade, Dutch ships had followed the old Portuguese track from the Cape, north along the African coast and across the middle of the Indian Ocean, a route of light and fickle winds where ships drifted for weeks in heat that spoiled their provisions and sickened their crews. Then, in the year 1611, a Dutch commander named Hendrik Brouwer tried something different. Instead of turning north after the Cape, he held south. Down into the latitudes sailors would come to call the Roaring Forties, where the winds of the Southern Ocean blow hard and almost ceaselessly from the west. He ran east before those winds for thousands of miles, made his northing only at the end, and arrived in Java in nearly half the usual time with a healthier crew. The company, recognizing a competitive advantage when it saw one, made the Brewer route compulsory. But the route had a flaw built into its geometry, and the flaw was this: a ship running east in the roaring 40s had to know when to turn north. And in the 1620s, there was no reliable way to know. Latitude, the distance north or south, a navigator could fix from the sun and stars with decent accuracy. Longitude, the distance east or west, he could only estimate by keeping a running account of the ship's speed and heading, a method called dead reckoning that accumulated error with every day and every current. The instructions said, in effect, run east for so many days, then turn left, and east of the turning point, still uncharted in any detail, lay the western coast of the Great Southland, the continent that would one day be called Australia, fringed for hundreds of miles by low islands and reefs that showed no light, made no sound, and rose barely a man's height above the sea. Dutch ships had already found that coast the hard way. In 1616, a ship called the Eendracht had sighted it and lived to report it, and her commander had left an inscribed pewter plate on an island there, the oldest European artifact of the continent. Others had scraped past its reefs in the dark and counted themselves blessed. The company's sailing orders warned of the danger in general terms. But a warning in general terms is a poor defense against a coast whose position no one could fix. In the early months of 1629, the Batavia ran her easting down through the roaring 40s, and somewhere in those grey weeks she lost the fleet. Ships often did. The ocean is large and the weather closes in. By late May she was sailing alone, which suited the men in the stern who had been whispering since the Cape, because a mutiny cannot be made in company. It was in these weeks, alone on the emptiest sea in the world, that the conspiracy took its next step, and the step was aimed at Lucretia Jans. The thinking behind it, as later testimony reconstructed it, was as cold as it was strange. To seize a ship, the mutineers needed the crew to be divided from its lawful commander. Better still, they needed Pelsert to commit some act of visible injustice that would give ordinary sailors a grievance. The plan, conceived in the circle around Jacobsis and Cornelis, was to provoke him. One night in the darkness of the gun deck or a passageway, a group of men seized Lucretia Jans. They were masked or blackened so she could not swear to their faces. And what they inflicted on her was a gross and deliberate assault, an act of degradation designed to be scandalous, carried out with tar and filth, an outrage against the most protected and most visible woman aboard. She survived it, and she did something the plotters had perhaps not fully reckoned on. She recognized a voice. The voice belonged to Jan Everts, the high boatswain, one of the skipper's own trusted men. The assault set the ship quietly ablaze. In the world of the 1600s, an attack of that kind on a gentlewoman under the company's protection demanded severe and public justice, and everyone aboard waited to see what the upper merchant would do. And here the record shows Pelsert hesitating. He was ill. He suspected, from the identity of the culprit, that the trail led upward toward the skipper himself. And he seems to have judged that arresting the skipper's men in mid-ocean, with the ship alone and the crew's loyalties uncertain, was more dangerous than waiting for the fleet or for Java. So he investigated slowly and punished no one, and his hesitation, meant as prudence, read to the conspirators as weakness and gave them time. Later, sifting everything that was said in the trials to come, investigators concluded that the mutiny was nearly ripe in those first days of June, that the plotters had settled their design and were waiting only for their moment. What intervened was not conscience and not discovery. What intervened was the coast that no one could fix on a chart. Arjen Jacobs reckoned his ship, in the early days of June, to be hundreds of miles from any land, with sea room to spare. On the night of the 3rd of June, 1629, the Batavia was running northeast under a bright moon. A fresh breeze on her quarter, her canvas full, making perhaps 4 or 5 knots through a long, low swell. It was, by the accounts of those who stood the watch, a beautiful night. Toward morning, in the last dark hours of the 4th of June, the lookout reported something pale on the water ahead, a whiteness in the moonlight off the bow. The skipper was called. He looked, and he made the most consequential judgment of his life. He said it was moonshine on the sea, the glitter of the moon path, nothing more. The ship stood on. And a little before daybreak, at the height of her pride and the depth of her corruption, the Batavia struck. She struck with her full way on, and the impact ran through her like a single great cord. The oak of her bows rode up onto coral. Her masts whipped forward against their stays, and everything loose between her decks, chests, crockery, sleeping men, went sliding and falling in the dark. Then came the sound that every deep-sea sailor most dreaded to hear, the grinding of a living hull against rock, felt in the soles of the feet as much as heard. The Batavia had run onto a reef in the Houtman Abrolhos, a sprawl of coral shoals and low islands, lying some 40 miles off the coast of the Southland, named for the Dutch commander who had charted their northern edge a decade earlier, and whose reports had warned every navigator to give them a wide berth. The reef she found is called Morning Reef, in the group later named the Wallaby Islands, and she found it at the worst possible state of the tide, near high water, so that as the sea fell away beneath her, she settled harder and harder onto the coral with no hope of floating free. The first hour aboard was chaos of the quieter, more dreadful kind. Darkness, confusion, hundreds of people spilling up from below into the wind. The officers shouting soundings, the pumps clanking as water found its way in through her opening seams. Jacobses did what seamanship demanded. He sounded around the ship and found deep water astern, tried to lighten her, had the mainmast cut away in the hope of easing her. But the falling mast fouled across the deck, and the ship only worked deeper into the coral's grip. When the light came up on the 4th of June, the people crowding her canted decks could finally see where fortune had delivered them, and the sight offered little comfort. They lay on a reef awash with breaking sea. Away to one side, low against the horizon, were islands, if the word can stretch so far. Flat pads of coral rubble and scrub, the largest of them barely a mile long, treeless, waterless, grey-green and utterly silent. No smoke rose anywhere. No sail showed. They had wrecked on the doorstep of an unknown continent, in an archipelago that appeared on their charts as little more than a smudge and a warning. The ship's boats, a longboat and a smaller yawl, survived, and through that first day and the days that followed, they ran a shuttle from the wreck to the nearest islands, carrying people first, and then whatever could be salvaged. Bread, casks, canvas for tents, a few barrels of water. The work was slow and dangerous, through surf that broke on the reef, and it proceeded amid scenes that told anyone watching how thin the ship's discipline had already worn. Below decks, with the world ending, some of the sailors broke into the liquor and the cargo, and there are accounts of men reeling drunk among the breaking seas, of chests smashed open, of a kind of carnival despair taking hold of the doomed ship, even as the boats worked alongside. Order aboard was dissolving a full season before Geronimus Cornelis would give that dissolution a doctrine. The ship herself took 9 days to die, and her dying was witnessed hour by hour from the islands. A slow public dismantling that worked on the survivors in ways the later testimony only hints at. Each morning they woke to find her changed, her stern lower, her foremast gone in the night, her decks opening seam by seam under the working of the swell, and each gale that came through carried more of her ashore to them. Planks and casks and drowned livestock, the furniture of their old world arriving as wreckage on the new one. Men still aboard signaled from her rails, and nothing could be done for them while the surf ran. Some lashed together rafts of hatch covers and spars and pushed off into the break, and the people on the island waded out to pull the lucky ones from the foam and stood watching, helpless, when the sets came through at the wrong moment and the rafts went over. When at last a great sea broke her back and the hull fell open, those on the island heard it across the water, a long groan and a settling roar, and the predicant wrote afterward that many wept, not only for the men lost with her, but for the ship, because while she stood on the reef, broken as she was, the world they had come from still had a shape and a mast against the sky, and when she went down into her own wreckage, the horizon closed, and the islands were all there was. Something like 100 more people reached shore alive across those 9 days, and among the last of them, floating in on a bowsprit spar after clinging to the wreck longer than nearly anyone, half drowned and strangely composed, came the under-merchant, whose arrival the earlier pages of this chronicle have already marked, and whose composure, the survivors would learn, was the stillness of a man who had been given time, on the settling hulk, to think. By the time the weather made further boat work impossible, around 180 people had been landed on a small island that would come to bear the darkest name in this story, and some 40 more, including Pelsart, Jacobs, most of the senior officers, and a share of the water and bread, were gathered on a second islet nearby, while several dozen men remained stranded aboard the wreck itself, unable to get off through the rising surf. Among those still aboard was Geronimus Cornelis. The situation on the islands announced itself within a day, and it was arithmetic, plain and pitiless. There were nearly 300 survivors. The islands had no springs, no streams, no trees. The water landed from the wreck amounted to a few casks among all those mouths, and the daily ration shrank at once to a cupful or less. Rain might come, for the southern winter was beginning, but no one could plan on rain. Pelsart and Jacobs, on their separate islet with the boats, searched the nearest islands for water and found none worth the name. And so, within days of the wreck, the leadership of the Batavia faced a decision that has been argued over ever since. The nearest help was the city of Batavia itself, on Java, some 2,000 miles away across open ocean. The longboat, decked over and rigged for the attempt, might carry 40 people and might survive the passage. It had been done before, barely. If it succeeded, a rescue ship could return within months. If it failed, no one in the world would ever know where the ship had died. On or about the 8th of June, after a last fruitless search for water along the islands and a brief probing of the mainland coast, the longboat stood away to the north. Aboard her were Francisco Pelsart, Ariane Jacobs, the high boatswain Jan Everts, most of the senior officers, a handful of passengers, including a woman with a nursing infant, and a crew of picked sailors, 48 souls in all, with the yawl following. They did not go back to the main island to explain, or to take letters, or to say farewell. From the crowded coral pad where nearly 200 people waited, the survivors saw the boats grow small against the north and disappear, and they understood, in whatever way each heart allowed, that they had been left. Pelsart would later write that the departure was the only course that offered anyone a chance of life, and cold arithmetic supports him. The boat could save the many only by leaving them. But those left behind gave their island a name that preserved their verdict on that morning. They called the little islet from which the boats had sailed the Traitors' Island, and the island where they waited, which appears on modern charts as Beacon Island, would earn from what came next a darker name still, Batavia's Graveyard. The voyage of the Batavia's longboat deserves its own quiet chapter, because it stands, by any measure, among the great feats of small boat seamanship, accomplished by men whose names the rest of this story will darken. The boat was perhaps 30 feet long, open or nearly so, decked over with salvaged canvas and planks, and into her were packed 48 people with a little bread and less water. Jacobs's, whatever else he was a superb seaman, and he took her first north along the unknown coast of the Southland, searching for a river mouth or a spring, closing a shore of red cliffs and dunes where the surf made landing all but impossible. Once or twice, parties struggled ashore through the breakers and dug in the sand behind the beach, finding water too brackish to drink, finding the footprints of people they never saw. The first recorded meetings, almost, between Europe and the western edge of that continent. Rain squalls saved them, caught in spread sails and sucked from the folds of canvas. Then, giving up the coast, Jacobs laid the boat's head northwest for Java and ran her out into the open Indian Ocean on the strength of memory and dead reckoning. For weeks the boat crawled across the sea, her people cramped past the point of pain, their ration a scrap of bread and a few swallows of water in the tropical heat. They endured storms that should have swamped her and calms that were nearly worse. And they made it. In the first days of July, 33 days out from the islands, the longboat raised the coast of Java, every soul aboard still living, and shortly afterward fell in with company ships that carried her people into the roadstead of Batavia city. It was an extraordinary deliverance, and it delivered its passengers into the hands of the law. The Governor-General of the Indies in that year was Jan Peter Zoon Cohen, the iron founder of the company's Eastern Empire, a man of famous severity, and he received the news of the flagship's loss with cold fury. Pelsart told his story. Questions were asked, and the story of the voyage before the wreck began, piece by piece, to come out. Within weeks, Ariane Jacobs was in the fortress prison of Batavia, held on suspicion arising from the assault on Lucretia Jans and the whispers of worse, and the high boatswain Jan Everts was tried for his part in that assault and hanged. Jacobs himself, tough and close-mouthed, admitted nothing, and his eventual fate is one of the story's loose threads. He disappears from the record still imprisoned, still denying, a man whom the evidence could shadow but never quite convict. Cohen, meanwhile, gave Pelsart a ship, a fast yacht called the Sardam, and orders that were simple to state and cruel in their arithmetic. Return to the wreck, save the people, and above all, recover the company's silver. The Sardam sailed from Java in the middle of July. The passage that had taken the longboat 33 days took the rescue ship far longer, beating south against the season, groping for a scatter of islands whose position no chart could fix. And it was late September before Pelsart raised the low grey line of the Abrolhos again. He had been gone, by then, more than 3 months, and it is here that this chronicle must turn back, as Pelsart himself had to the islands, and to what had been happening among the people he left behind. It happened slowly at first, which is part of what makes it so hard to hold in the mind. When the boats vanished north in the second week of June, the survivors on Batavia's graveyard numbered around 180. Sailors, soldiers, company clerks, the predicant and his family, women, children, the sick, and the whole. In the days that followed, the men still trapped aboard the wreck came ashore as the ship broke up beneath them, some on rafts and hatch covers, many drowning in the attempt, and among those who survived the passage through the surf, floating in on a spar after days alone on the settling hulk, came the under-merchant, Geronimus Cornelis. His arrival changed everything, though no one could see it yet, and the first change looked like order. Cornelis was, by the company's own hierarchy, the highest official left alive on the islands. The survivors had already formed a rough council to manage the rationing of water and food, and Cornelis, smooth, confident, splendidly dressed in clothing salvaged from the company's stores, took his natural place at its head. For a few weeks, the little society functioned, and the shape of its functioning deserves a moment of quiet attention, because it was, however briefly, a genuine achievement. Tents of canvas rose on the coral, laid out in rough streets, the predicant's household here, the unmarried women there under what protection could be arranged. The sick gathered where the surgeon's surviving mate could tend them. Rations were issued by list and by signature. Water measured out under the eyes of appointed men. And the little community developed, as stranded communities always do, its economies and its routines. Parties fishing the reef flats at low tide, boys gathering birds' eggs, salvage crews working the tide line each morning for whatever the wreck had sent across in the night. Driftwood husbanded for the cooking fires, sea lion meat smoked against leaner days. There were prayers morning and evening, and the psalms of the Sunday services carried thin across the water between the islands. Children played among the guy ropes, because children play anywhere. Couples courted, because people court anywhere. A society of castaways, given rein and a fair division, could have endured in the Abrolhos for a long time. And the tragedy folded inside the greater tragedy of the Batavia is that the survivors proved it in those first weeks, under the presidency of the very man who was privately deciding that most of them had to die. Rain fell, easing the thirst that had already, in the first desperate days, killed some of the weakest. Fish, birds, and sea lions could be taken among the islands. The immediate dying stopped, and something like routine took hold. But Cornelis, presiding over his council of castaways, was doing his own arithmetic, and his numbers pointed in a direction all his own. He knew, as few others on the island did, how close the ship had come to mutiny before the reef intervened, because he had helped to plan that mutiny, and he could not know what Jacobses or the boatswain might confess or reveal in Java. If a rescue ship came, it might come bearing his arrest. His safest future, he reasoned, was to be master of whatever the rescuers found, to seize the rescue ship itself when it arrived, with a crew of hardened followers, and take up the life of fortune the reef had interrupted, with the salvaged silver of the Batavia below his own quarterdeck. For that he needed his followers armed and everyone else helpless. And there was a second, colder strand to his reasoning, the pure arithmetic of water and bread. Fewer people meant longer supplies. On an island of nearly 200 souls, the largest single group who might oppose him were the soldiers, disciplined men who knew how to fight. So the first moves, when they came, wore the mask of administration. The council, guided by its president, ordered the survivors dispersed for their own good across the islands of the group. Parties sent here and there where fish or birds were said to be plentiful, and the soldiers, the most dangerous men on the island, were dealt with by a stroke of genuine cunning. A party of about 20 of them, under the Frisian private Weber Hayes, was ferried across the deep channel to the two largest islands of the group, the High Islands as the castaways called them, with orders to search for water, and with a promise: light 3 fires when water is found, and boats will come for the signal. They were landed without weapons. The boats went back. And Cornelis, watching the channel between, was confident that he had just sent 20 inconvenient men to die of thirst on the far side of deep water, while their signal fires, if they ever rose, would summon no one at all. What followed on Batavia's graveyard, through July and August of 1629, is among the darkest passages in the history of the sea, and it will be told here as the channel tells all such things, plainly and without relish, because the dead deserve the truth, and the sleeping listener deserves peace. Cornelis began by consolidating his instrument. Around him he gathered a company of followers, mostly young men, cadets from good families sailing out to make their fortunes. Tough sailors, a soldier or two, some of them former conspirators from the ship, others recruited on the island through flattery, fear, and the strange gravitational pull of his talk. He dressed them in scarlet cloth and gold lace from the salvaged cargo, bound them with signed oaths of loyalty that he drafted and redrafted like the lawyer he half was, and fed them on his private philosophy, the doctrine that had followed him from Harlem, that there was no such thing as sin for the elect, that whatever he willed was willed through him by heaven, and that the deaths he required of them therefore carried no guilt at all. Then the killings began, and at first they were disguised as law. A man accused of stealing from the stores was tried by the council and executed. Then men were accused of plotting and drowned or dispatched quietly. Then the disguise itself was allowed to fall away. Parties of survivors who had been dispersed to the outlying islets were visited by boats in the night and did not see morning. The mutineers went among them with knives and improvised weapons, and the sea received the evidence. On the main island, people were taken one by one and in small groups, on any pretext or none. The sick, the inconvenient, the strong who might resist, the boys who talked too much. The predicant Bastiennes was kept alive, perhaps for the strange legitimacy his presence conferred. But on a single evening in July, his wife and children, all but one grown daughter, were taken from him at a stroke, killed in their tent while he was held elsewhere at a supper table by the mutineers' hospitality. He survived, hollowed, ministering as he could among people who now understood that any night might be theirs. The women who were spared into servitude. A handful, chosen by the mutineers, were held for their use, and among them, reserved by Cornelis for himself, was Lucretia Jans, whose long ordeal aboard the ship thus deepened on land, and who endured it, witnesses later said, with a composure that shamed her captors, without ever provoking them into adding her to the dead. By the end of that southern winter, the mutineers had killed, by the reckoning of the trials that followed, well over 100 people, men, women, and children, out of the 200 or so who had been alive on the islands when the boats left for Java. There is no way to make such a number gentle, and this chronicle will not try. It will only note, as the historians note, how few the killers were, a few dozen at the very most, with a hard-core smaller still, and how the machinery of it ran not on rage, but on organization. Lists, oaths, boat schedules, the calm administrative evil of a man who kept accounts. Cornelis himself, by every testimony, rarely used his own hands. He ordered, he persuaded, he tested the loyalty of new men by requiring a death of them, and he presided, in his scarlet and gold, over a court of castaway finery on a coral waste, styling himself Captain General of the islands. And yet, even at the darkest of it, the story had already begun to turn, out on the high islands across the channel, where the 20 soldiers of Weeby Hayes had been sent to die. They had not died. For nearly 3 weeks they had searched the flat expanses of their islands, living on rain caught in scraps of sail and in the hollows of rocks. And then they had found what the coral islets could never offer. Wells, natural soaks in the limestone, where drinkable water gathered, enough for many more than 20 men. They found something else too, small marsupials, the Tamar wallabies that would one day give the islands their name, trusting creatures that had never learned to fear a human being, and birds and eggs and fish in abundance. The high islands, alone in the whole archipelago, could support life indefinitely. True to their orders and to their honor, Hayes and his men lit their 3 fires and watched the channel for boats. The boats that eventually came brought not relief parties but refugees, swimmers and paddlers on driftwood and stolen dinghies, survivors escaping the main island with the truth. From them, Hayes learned what the smoke of his signal fires had been rising over, and what his little command now was. It was the only armed force of the innocent left in the islands, if a company without weapons can be called armed, and it was next on the list. because Cornelis could not leave it be. The soldiers held the water. Any rescue ship standing in toward the islands would see their fires and touch there first and hear everything. So the war came to Weeby Hayes, and he prepared for it with a soldier's practicality that reads, "Across 4 centuries, like the first cool breeze in a long fever." His men gathered the flat slabs of coral limestone that littered their island and built walls. A low fortification with a lookout, the first European structure ever raised on Australian soil, built not against the peoples of that continent, but against other Dutchmen. They made weapons from what the islands and the wreck's drift gave them. Pikes of driftwood tipped with nails, clubs studded with spikes, slings for throwing stones. They organized watches, posted sentries on the shallows at low tide where the channel could be waded, and they waited, 47 strong now with the refugees who had reached them, for the boats they knew would come. The boats came at the end of July. The mutineers crossed the channel in their salvaged craft. A raiding party of perhaps 24, led by one of Cornelis's lieutenants, expecting to find a rabble of thirst-weakened castaways, and found instead disciplined men behind stone, on ground of their own choosing, in water that broke up any charge before it could form. The soldiers met them in the shallows with pikes and stones and drove them back to their boats. Some days later, the mutineers came again, in greater strength, and were beaten again, wading attackers against defenders who had spent their days rehearsing exactly this. The defeats told Cornelis something that must have unsettled the deep, smooth confidence he wore like his scarlet coat. Force was not going to work. So he reached for the tool that had never yet failed him, and in the first days of September, he crossed the channel himself, under a flag of parley, to negotiate. He came with gifts and promises, offering peace, blankets, wine, a share of everything. And he came also with private letters, smuggled to the handful of French-speaking soldiers in Hayes's company, inviting them to betray their comrades for gold. It was the performance of his life, and it failed completely. The French soldiers took the letters straight to Hayes, and Hayes, who had by now heard from the refugees every detail of what the man across the table had ordered done, let the negotiation play out to its end. And then, when Cornelis and his small escort were within reach on the final day of parley, his men fell on them. The escort was killed in the scuffle or scattered. One man escaped to the boats, and Geronimus Cornelis, Captain General of the islands, apothecary of Haarlem, was taken alive, bound, and put in a pit on West Wallaby Island, a prisoner of the private he had sent across the water to die. It was the hinge of the whole story, and it had been swung by the lowest-ranking hero in it. The mutineers, leaderless, chose a new captain from among themselves, a soldier named Wouter Loos, harder-handed and simpler than Cornelis, and Loos understood that the game was now a race. Somewhere over the northern horizon, a rescue ship might already be searching, and whoever held the islands when she arrived would tell the story the rescuers heard first. He gathered every fighting man and every weapon the mutineers possessed, including 2 muskets that had been salvaged dry from the wreck. And in the middle of September, he led the last and greatest assault across the channel. It was the most dangerous attack yet, because the muskets outranged everything the defenders had, and the fight went on for hours, the soldiers holding their walls under fire they could not answer, taking wounds, and the outcome was still unsettled when a sail lifted over the northern horizon. It was the Sardom. Francisco Pelsayat had returned at last, after more than 3 months, groping his way south along the archipelago, and his lookouts raised the islands on the 17th of September, in the very hours when the future of every survivor was being decided in the shallows. Both sides saw her at once, and the battle simply dissolved, because both sides understood what the next hour meant. Whoever reached Pelsart first would own the truth. What followed was a boat race across miles of broken water. Weeby Hayes in the defender's little yawl pulling for the ship with everything his tired men had left, and a boatload of mutineers, still in their scarlet and lace, pulling from the other quarter. Hayes won. He came alongside the Sardam and climbed aboard and stood before the astonished upper merchant, a common soldier with an impossible report: that the islands were in the hands of murderers, that more than 100 of the people Pelsayert had left alive were dead, that the man responsible lay bound in a pit on the island ahead, and that a boat of armed mutineers was at that moment approaching the ship with treachery in mind. Pelsayert had just time to act on it. When the mutineers' boat came alongside, they found the rail lined and the ship ready, and they were ordered to throw their weapons into the sea before a man of them came up the side. They obeyed. Whatever wild plan had lived in that boat to swarm a rescue yacht as Cornelis had dreamed, died in that moment without a blow, and the last of the mutiny of the Batavia ended not in battle, but in a quiet clatter of blades going over the gunwale into clear water. The days that followed were arrests, and then the days after that were the accounting. Pelsayert took possession of the islands, freed the prisoners, gathered the survivors, and confronted the arithmetic of what had happened in his absence. Of the roughly 341 people who had sailed from Texel, and the nearly 300 who had survived the wreck itself, there now remained, between Hayes's Island and the remnant on Batavia's graveyard, fewer than 130, and the greater part of the missing had died, not by water, but by the hands of their own shipmates. The evidence lay everywhere: in the shallow graves in the coral rubble, in the testimony that began to pour out of survivors who had spent 2 months holding their tongues to stay alive, and in the extraordinary person of Cornelis himself, delivered bound from his pit, who from the first interrogation talked and talked, blaming the dead skipper's plot, blaming his own followers, insisting that he had never killed with his own hands, retracting confessions and remaking them, a man performing for his life to an audience that had already seen the graves. Pelsayert now faced a problem no company manual had anticipated. He held, aboard a small yacht already crowded with survivors, several dozen prisoners implicated in the deaths of more than 100 people, and Java lay a month or more away across an ocean that had already destroyed one ship under him. To carry the whole conspiracy home alive was to invite them to attempt the Sardam, as they had planned to attempt her at anchor, and every officer aboard understood it. So Pelsayert convened, on the islands themselves, under the authority his commission gave him, a formal court, the broad council of the ship, and put the leaders of the mutiny on trial on the coral where their acts had been committed. The trials occupied the last days of September and the weeks that followed, and their record survives, question by question, because Pelsayert was a company man to his bones and documented everything. The procedure of the age permitted examination under torture for capital crimes where strong evidence already existed, and it was used, principally the water torture of the period. It is a hard thing to record of the justice side of this story, but the record is the record, and the channel does not prettify either direction. Under examination and outside it, the confessions accumulated and interlocked, follower confirming follower, until the sequence of that winter's deaths stood reconstructed in ink. Who had ordered? Who had rowed? Who had held? Who had struck? Cornelis twisted longest, confessing and revoking through session after session, but the testimony of his own men closed over him like water. On the 28th of September, 1629, the council pronounced its sentences, and on the 2nd of October, they were carried out on Seal Island, a bare islet chosen for the purpose. Gallows were raised from salvaged timber, the first European executions on Australian soil in a country not yet named. The days before the sentences were carried out have their own texture in the record, and it is a stranger and quieter texture than the bare facts suggest. The condemned were held on Seal Island under guard, and the predicant Gijsbert Bastiens, whose wife and children lay in the coral of the neighboring island by the orders of the men before him, went among them in his office as minister, praying with those who would pray, hearing what they wished to say, urging upon each of them the repentance of their faith. And the survivors, watching from a distance, understood that they were seeing the trellis of the old world being set back up, plank by plank, in the very place where it had been torn down. Law, record, clergy, sentence, all the forms restored, and restored deliberately. Because Pelsayat understood, as the company understood, that the forms were the point, that what had happened on the islands was precisely what the absence of forms permits, and that the answer had to be made of forms or it was no answer at all. Several of the condemned made full confessions in those last days, set down by the clerks in the same steady hand that had recorded everything else. One or two held to their story that they had acted only under fear of death, and the record preserves their words without comment, leaving the weighing of them, then as now, to whoever reads. The boy among them wept, witnesses said, and the men were quieter, and Cornelis alone continued to the end to conduct himself as though the proceedings were a misunderstanding that a sufficiently clever argument might still dissolve. And it is perhaps the most complete portrait of him that exists. A man arguing with the gallows in the belief that everything, including this, was negotiable. 7 men and a boy of the conspiracy's core were hanged that morning. Geronimus Cornelis went first by rank, and the sentence, in the manner of the age toward crimes it found beyond ordinary reckoning, ordered that both his hands be struck off before he was hanged, and it was done. Witnesses recorded that he remained himself to the last breath, unrepentant, disputing, calling down vengeance, dying as he had lived, entirely certain. The rope ended the disputation, and the sea wind carried on over Seal Island as it had before and has since. 2 of the condemned received a different sentence, and it is one of the strangest footnotes in the whole history of that continent. Wouter Loos, the mutineers' last captain, and a ship's boy named Jan Pelgrom de Bay, a lost and pliable adolescent whose part in the killings had appalled even his judges but whose youth stayed the rope, were sentenced to be marooned on the mainland coast. In November, as the Sardam worked north, the 2 were set ashore on the beach of the Southland near the mouth of a river, with a small boat, trade goods, and instructions to make contact with the peoples of the country and to watch for Dutch ships in years to come. They were never seen by European eyes again. What became of them, whether they perished on that dry coast or lived out their lives among the Aboriginal peoples of the region, no record tells, but by the plain fact of their landing, the first 2 European residents of Australia were a mutineer and a murderer's apprentice, left there by the justice of the Dutch East India Company, a century and a half before any British sail entered those seas. Lesser prisoners were carried to Java for trial, and while the trials proceeded, Pelsayat turned to the errand that, in the company's eyes, had justified the whole rescue. The Silver, the wreck of the Batavia, lay broken on Morning Reef in shallow water, her upper works gone, her hull opening season by season, and the Sardam carried divers for exactly this work. Free divers from the Gujarati coast of India, whose skill in such recoveries was famous across the company's world. Through October and into November, they went down again and again into the surge over the reef, naked to the water in the southern spring cold, each dive a single held breath into the wreck's dim interior, working by feel among fallen guns and shifting planking with the swell dragging at them, marking what they found with buoyed lines for the boats above. It was work of extraordinary skill and nerve, and Pelsayat's journal, sparing with praise, pauses over it, and the salvage they achieved under those conditions, in an age without any diving apparatus at all, stands with the longboat voyage among the story's feats of pure capability. One by one the iron-bound chests came up out of the coral, 10 of the 12, along with cannon and coin and goods, until weather and the working of the wreck closed the account. One chest was jammed beneath a fallen cannon beyond any moving. Another had been broached long before, in the strange, drunken days when the ship was breaking up, or by the mutineers trading among themselves. The great cameo, the agate jewel of emperors, came home safe. In the middle of November, the Sardam weighed at last and stood north for Java, carrying the recovered treasure, the surviving prisoners, and the remnant of the Batavia's people. The predicant, with his one surviving daughter, Lucretia Jans, widowed as she would soon learn, even of the husband she had sailed to join, the soldiers of the high islands, the handful of women and children the winter had spared, and Weeby Hayes, who had boarded the longboat of history a private and left the islands an officer, promoted sergeant by Pelsayat on the spot, with further promotion and reward to follow from the Governor-General himself. Even that last passage was not free of the voyage's shadow, for the Sardam too met foul weather, and more of the rescued died at sea before Java rose over the bow. But she came in the first days of December, 1629, 13 months and half a world from Texel, and delivered to the city of Batavia the survivors of the ship that had carried its name. The city received them with the mixed arithmetic that governed everything the company did. The silver was counted and found nearly whole, which mattered most in the ledgers. The prisoners were retried under the courts of the Indies, and several more of the mutiny's second rank went to the gallows, or to lesser punishments, floggings, keel haulings, years in chains, graded by the council's judgment of each man's hands and heart. A few of the youngest and least implicated were pardoned into service. The boy who had been hanged on Seal Island was already beyond appeal, and the record of these later trials, cooler and further from the graves, shows the judges wrestling with a question that has never really been settled since. How far obedience under mortal fear excuses a man, and where the excusing ends. Some of those who had done as they were told to stay alive were punished lightly or not at all. Some were not so fortunate, and reading the sentences 4 centuries later, one feels the court groping in territory where the law's usual lanterns gave poor light. The principles of the story scattered into their separate fates, and it is worth following each of them a little way, because the sea keeps its accounts long after the voyage ends. Francisco Pelsayat did not prosper. He had brought home the silver and the survivors, but he had also, in the company's eyes, presided over the loss of its finest ship, left the islands in the charge of a man who had turned them into a graveyard, and failed on the night of the wreck in ways that the inquiry did not forget. The same record that praised his rescue noted that command had frayed under him long before the reef. The Governor-General's council held him partly answerable. His property was sequestered for a time, and his health, never strong since India, gave way under the year's weight. He was sent on one further expedition, to Sumatra, fell gravely ill, and died in Batavia in September of 1630, within a year of his return from the islands, not yet middle-aged, his career and his fortune both under cloud. History has been kinder to him than his employers were, and also less kind in different rooms. His journals gave the world the story, and his hesitations helped to shape it. And both of those things are true at once, which is the way of actual human beings. Ariane Jacobses, the skipper, remained in the fortress prison, interrogated repeatedly about the mutiny plot, admitting nothing that survives, protected by the drowning of so many who might have testified, and by his own hard silence. The company held him without conviction for years, and the record simply loses him there, in prison and unbroken. Whether he died in his cell or was ever quietly released, no surviving document says. Of all the story's principles, the man whose misjudgment found the reef and whose grievance helped light the fuse is the one who simply fades from the page. Lucretia Jans reached Java to find her husband dead of fever before ever hearing of her ordeal. She was, for a time, entangled in the legal aftermath, for the strange logic of the age required her to defend her own conduct on the islands. And she did, and was vindicated. She remarried in the Indies, a soldier who rose to officer's rank, returned eventually to the Netherlands, and lived out a long and private life in the town of Leiden, dying somewhere past the age of 60, one of the very few souls who walked through every circle of the Batavia's story: the ship, the assault, the graveyard island, the captivity, and out the other side into ordinary years. The predicant Gijsbert Bastiaans served congregations in the East, remarried, wrote a long letter home that survives as one of the story's most human documents. Grief and faith holding each other upright in run-on 17th century sentences, and died a few years later in the Indies, never having returned to the country where his first family had been whole. And Weber Hayes, the private from Winschoten who had held the water and the walls, was made a sergeant on the islands and an officer in Batavia, celebrated briefly as the one clean figure of the whole affair, and then, like the common soldier he was, vanished into the company's endless wars in the Spice Islands, where the records of ordinary officers were thin and lives were short. No portrait of him exists, no grave of him is known. The Netherlands, in time, named naval vessels for him, and the little fort of coral slabs he raised still stands where his men piled it, which is more permanence than most sergeants get. The company, for its part, drew its lessons in its own language. Sailing orders for the Brouwer route were tightened, with sterner warnings about the Southland's hidden coast and the reckoning of easting. The divided command of merchant and skipper was examined and left largely as it was, because the structure served the ledgers even when it failed the ships. And the Abrolhos took their place on the charts with a new and specific dread attached. None of it sufficed because the underlying problem, the impossibility of knowing longitude, remained unsolved for another century, and the same coast went on collecting Dutch ships with a patience all its own. In 1656, the Vergulde Drek struck a reef north of the Abrolhos and was lost with most of her people, her survivors vanishing into the Southland after their boat reached Java. In 1712, the Zuidorp drove ashore under sheer cliffs south of Shark Bay and simply disappeared from history, her fate unread until beachcombers found coins beneath the cliffs more than 2 centuries later. And in 1727, the Zeewijk piled onto the southern Abrolhos, within 60 miles of the Batavia's bones, and her castaways, who knew the older story, lived out their own island winter in its long shadow, building from the wreckage a little sloop that carried the remnant of them to Java, the first ocean-going vessel ever built on Australian ground. The western coast of that continent became, chart by chart and wreck by wreck, a Dutch coastline in everything but possession, its capes and islands wearing the names of ships and skippers: Houtman, Eendracht, Dirk Hartog, Zeewijk, a shoreline written in the language of a country that never settled it. The story itself, meanwhile, refused to die, and the manner of its survival is its own quiet chapter. Within a year or two of the Saardam's return, accounts of the wreck and the mutiny were circulating in the Netherlands, and in 1647, an Amsterdam printer gathered Pelsaert's journals and the trial records into a book. The Ongelukkige Voyage, the unlucky voyage of the ship Batavia, illustrated with engravings of the wreck, the islands, and the executions, and the book sold, edition after edition, because the Dutch public found in it exactly what a seafaring nation half wants and half dreads to read about itself. For the people of the 17th century Republic, whose sons and brothers signed onto those fleets by the thousand, the Batavia was not a distant horror, but a family possibility, the letter that might come instead of the sailor. The book kept the story alive through the company's golden age, and then the company itself declined, went bankrupt at the end of the 1700s and dissolved, and its millions of pages of records went into archives where they slept, and the Batavia sank a second time out of common memory into the footnotes. Through the 1800s, she survived mainly as a sailor's tale on the Western Australian coast, where the new British colony's fishermen and guano diggers worked the abrolhos and told half-remembered stories of a Dutch ship and Dutch murders somewhere among the islands, without agreeing on where. Wreckage was sighted from time to time, in this group or that, and misidentified. The Zeewijk's remains in the southern islands were taken for the Batavias for decades, which pulled every search generations of miles from the truth. Human bones turned up occasionally on Beacon Island under the spades of fishermen building camps, and were reburied or shrugged over, relics of a story nobody could quite name. It took the 20th century and one determined woman to bring the ship back. Henrietta Drake Brockman was a Western Australian novelist and historian who came to the Batavia through fiction and stayed for the truth. And through the 1940s and 50s, she did what no one had troubled to do in 300 years. She went back to the sources. She had Pelsiart's original journals in the archives at The Hague, translated in full, and she read them as a navigator's documents rather than as a horror story, matching his courses, bearings, and descriptions against modern charts of the abrolhos. The journals described deep water close to the wreck, islands of particular shapes and relations, wells on the high islands, and none of it fitted the southern group where tradition placed the ship. It fitted the northern group, the Wallaby Islands. And in print, years before anyone found a timber, Drake Brockman said so plainly, the Batavia would be found in the Wallabies, near Beacon Island. She was met with the polite skepticism that greets most people who correct a settled story from a desk. Then the sea itself began to hand up evidence. In 1960, a fisherman diving near the islands brought up human remains from a shallow grave on Beacon Island. And this time, they went to a museum instead of back into the sand. And in June of 1963, a crayfisherman named Dave Johnson, who had quietly known for years of an anchor and old cannon lying in the surf break-off Morning Reef, where he set his pots, guided a small party of divers to the spot, among them Max and Graham Kramer, amateur divers from the town of Geraldton. They went down through the surge and came up having seen what no living eye had seen. Cannon furred with coral, anchors like fallen gateposts, a scatter of ballast and bronze across the reef flat. The Batavia lying exactly where Henrietta Drake Brockman had said she would lie. The news went around the world, and it arrived in an Australia newly awake to the idea that its European story did not begin where the schoolbooks said. Here, off the western coast, lay a ship a century and a half older than the First Fleet, with a drama attached that no novelist would dare invent. The Western Australian Museum took charge of the site, and through the 1970s its maritime archaeologists, led by figures such as Jeremy Green, conducted one of the great underwater excavations of the age, working in the break of the open Indian Ocean, mapping the wreck timber by timber. What they raised, over seasons of work, went far past coin and cannon. A great section of the ship herself came up, the port side of her stern, oak planking and frames, preserved for 3 centuries under sand and coral. The largest piece of a 17th century East Indiaman anywhere recovered, and with it, the everyday inventory of her floating village. Navigation instruments, surgeon's gear, pewter and stoneware, bearded jugs from the Rhineland, the small personal things of people whose names stand in the muster rolls. And out of the hold, block by numbered block, came the sandstone portico, the prefabricated gateway for the castle at Batavia, complete enough to reassemble. The timbers were conserved through years of patient treatment and raised into a gallery in Fremantle, where the ship's actual stern now stands to her original height. And beside her, the portico was put together at last, a doorway finally standing upright on the far shore it had been sailing toward, 3.5 centuries late and several hundred miles south of its address. The sea had kept the ship, but the islands had kept the people, and the second act of the rediscovery belongs to the land. Beacon Island in the later 20th century was a working fisherman's camp, a scatter of huts and jetties on the coral pad where Batavia's graveyard had been, and for decades the two identities coexisted uneasily, crayfish pots stacked over unmarked graves. From the 1960s onward, the graves began to give up their dead to archaeology rather than accident. Skeletons came out of the shallow coral rubble, singly and in groups, men, women, adolescents, children. Some laid out with what looks like care, others tumbled into pits several at a time, and the bones carried their testimony with them. The marks of blade and blunt force, wounds to the head and shoulders, injuries that matched case by case, the depositions Pelsert's clerks had taken down on those same islands. In the 2000s and 2010s, the work became systematic. The fishing huts were progressively removed. The island was surveyed with ground-penetrating instruments, and teams from Australian and Dutch universities excavated with the full forensic patience of modern science. A mass grave found beneath one of the old hut sites held the remains of several individuals interred together, and around the skeletons, the archaeologists could read small, stubborn human facts. This man had eaten well all his life, and grown up far from the sea, said the chemistry of his teeth. This adolescent had already done years of hard labor, said the ridges of muscle attachment. This person was buried before the flesh had cooled, said the position of the hands. Isotopes in tooth enamel traced childhoods to the Netherlands, to Germany, to places the muster rolls would predict, and in a few cases researchers have edged toward matching a skeleton to a name in the trial record. A convergence of document and bone across 4 centuries that very few events in history allow. The scientists who do this work speak of it in their papers and interviews with a noticeable gentleness, as though the island imposes its own register. The dead of Batavia's graveyard, having waited so long in anonymous sand, are being given back, one at a time, the only things anyone can still give them: their faces, their origins, and the truthful account of their last hour. Across the deep channel, on West Wallaby, the other monument needed no excavation at all, because it had never fallen. The little fort of Weeby Hayes stands today as his soldiers stacked it. 2 low structures of flat coral slabs, walls thigh-high to chest-high, weathered to the color of the island itself, with the wide flats before it where the wading battles were fought. It is counted, formally, as the oldest surviving European structure in Australia, older by a century and a half than any building in Sydney, and it is reachable only as it ever was, by boat and then on foot across the flats, so that the visitors who stand at it have earned the standing. Nearby, the wells that saved the defenders still hold water after rain, and the Tamar wallabies still graze the saltbush, still only half afraid, the descendants of the animals that fed 47 people through a season of siege. Few places on Earth hold their history so lightly and so completely at once. There is nothing at the fort but stone, wind, birds, and the exact geometry of survival, unchanged. And in the Netherlands, at the other end of the story's long thread, the ship herself was born a second time. In the 1980s, at the town of Lelystad, on reclaimed land that had been open sea in Pelsert's day, a master shipwright named Willem Vos began the construction of a full-scale sailing replica of the Batavia, built over 10 years by hundreds of young trainees using the timbers, tools, and methods of the 1620s. Oak frames shaped by eye and adze, hemp rigging, hand-stitched sails, the carved red lion at the bow. The replica was launched in the middle 1990s and floats today at the Batavia Wharf, the Batavia Wharf, where visitors can walk her decks and stand in the stern cabins and grasp, in a way no page can convey, how small the wooden world of 341 people actually was. How low the beams, how close the air, how short the walk from the great cabin where Pelsert lay ill to the bunks where the whispering began. Between the museum in Fremantle, which holds the true bones of the ship and the reassembled portico, and the wharf in Lelystad, which holds her living shape, the two ends of the Batavia's voyage now face each other across the whole width of the earth. The departure and the arrival she never made, and the traveller who has stood in both places reports the same quiet vertigo in each. The sense of a story so improbable that only its evidence compels belief. The evidence by now is a literature of its own. The story has been told and retold in Hugh Edwards's account of the wreck's finding, written with the salt of the discovery still on it, in Henrietta Drake Brockman's foundational research, in Mike Dash's patient reconstruction of Cornelis and his world, in novels and an opera and paintings and documentaries, and each generation's retelling bends toward its own preoccupations. The age of empire reading it as a tale of order restored. The modern age reading it as a study of ideology and obedience, of how a persuasive man with a doctrine that dissolves guilt can make ordinary people do what they would once have died rather than do. The islands themselves keep all the versions and endorse none. They are a nature reserve now, breeding grounds for sea lions and noddies and shearwaters. Their waters worked in season by the crayfishermen whose huts once stood over the graves. And the visitor who lands at Beacon Island today finds a low, bright and wind-scoured place, smaller than the story it carries, where the past lies a hand's depth under the coral sand, and the present goes about its business over it, as the present always does. It is worth turning back now, in the unhurried way this channel keeps for its closing hours, and walking the whole voyage again more slowly, pausing at the places the first telling had to pass at a chronicle's pace, because the Batavia's story lives in its details, and details are what the drifting mind holds gentlest. Begin again at Texel in the last days of October 1628, and consider the simple sensory truth of what it was to go aboard. A new East Indiaman smelled of tar, fresh oak shavings, hemp, tallow, and the livestock penned on her deck. Pigs and sheep and crated hens whose noise never entirely stopped. 341 people descended into a hole shorter than a modern city block, and the space allotted to most of them was the width of their own shoulders. Sailors slept where their watch left them, on the gun deck among the cables. Soldiers were berthed below the waterline in the orlop, where a tall man could not stand, and daylight never came. The passengers of quality had cabins in the stern the size of cupboards, and counted themselves fortunate. Food came from the coppers of the galley twice a day: barley gruel, dried peas, salted pork or beef, whose age was a running joke older than any sailor, hard bread that improved once the weevils were shaken loose, and small beer or a ration of wine, because water in casks turned foul within weeks and beer kept. Scurvy was not yet understood, but its schedule was well known. The first cases at around 3 months out, the gums, the old wounds reopening, the strange lethargy, which is one reason the Cape mattered so much, fresh food being the cure nobody could explain. The ship's surgeon and his mates dealt with the rest: fractures, fevers, the flux, with a chest of instruments and remedies that a former apothecary like Geronimus Cornelis would have known intimately. Mercury and rhubarb, plasters and lancets, skill and helplessness in roughly equal measure. Days were ruled by the bell and the glass, the half-hour sand glass turned by the ship's boys, 8 bells to a watch, the whole company living inside a clock made of sand and habit. Sundays brought the predicant service. Evenings, in fair weather, brought what entertainment 300 confined people could make. songs, dice, and cards where the officers tolerated them. Talk, endless talk, the ship's true fuel. And through this crowded, regulated, smell-soaked wooden world moved the people whose choices this story has followed. Not yet villains or heroes, just names on a muster roll, standing their watches, eating their peas, watching the same horizon. The children aboard deserve a moment of their own because the muster carried many. The predicant's household alone numbering 7 of his children from grown to small. And there were babies at the breast and boys of 8 or 10 who belonged to families, alongside the ship's boys who belonged to the ship. For the young ones, the Batavia was simply the world, its dangers invisible, its routines eternal. The great white pyramids of canvas overhead the roof of everything. They crossed the line, saw flying fish come aboard like flung silver, learned the ship's language, and slept through the night watches to the one lullaby every soul aboard shared. The working groan of a wooden hull under sail, which sailors said was the ship talking to herself. Nothing in this chronicle is harder to hold than the knowledge of where the voyage was carrying most of them, and the channel will not hold it long. It is enough to have seen them once as they were, alive on the deck in the trade-wind weather before any of it. Pause, too, at the Cape, because the Cape was the voyage's single breath of land, and the accounts of such stops glow with it. The boats going ashore through kelp, the smell of earth and greenery arriving across the water before the anchor was down, fresh meat traded for copper and tobacco, penguins and seals regarded with wonder, the flat mountain wearing its cloth of cloud. Ships' companies came back from the Cape measurably healthier and measurably happier, and the fleet that stood south from Table Bay in the autumn of 1629, southern autumn, the roaring 40s winter coming on, carried that brief well-being away into the cold. The 40s themselves ask a moment of the imagination. There is no sea on earth like the belt of ocean below Africa, where no land interrupts the wind's fetch all the way around the planet, and the swells build west to east forever. Long grey ridges 1/2 mile crest to crest, and a running ship rides them for weeks, lifting and sinking through her whole height, her rigging in a constant deep hum. It was cold, wet, magnificent sailing, the fastest most of those aboard would ever move, and the people of the ship experienced it each according to their station. The sailors aloft in the grey gales, earning every guilder of their wages. The passengers in the stern learning to sleep braced against the roll. The soldiers below enduring in the wet dark. The livestock on deck thinning week by week toward the coppers. The whole company drawn closer to the fires of the galley and to one another as the southern winter deepened around them. And it was also, for the navigators, a run made blindfold. The log line streamed and the compass watched, and the guesses accumulating. 60 miles of uncertainty, then 100, then more, the ship's true place on the earth dissolving a little further with every watch, until the difference between open ocean and a coral coast came down, on a bright June night, to one man's reading of a whiteness on the water. He read it as moonlight. Every telling of this story arrives at that moment and stops, because everything divides there, and it is worth resting in it once more, gently, without judgment. The lookout saw surf and said so. Ariane Jacobses, 30 years at sea, looked at the same whiteness and saw the moon's path, and his reading was not foolish. Moonglade on a ruffled sea has deceived 1,000 watchkeepers, and by his reckoning, the nearest land lay far over the horizon. He carried, that night, the invisible accumulated error of 5,000 miles of dead reckoning, and it had gathered, as such errors will, in the one direction that mattered. There was no wickedness in the mistake. The wickedness aboard the Batavia was all in other men and other plans, and one of the story's strangest mercies, if the word can stretch so far, is that the reef interrupted a mutiny. Had the ship passed clear that night, she would likely have been seized on some later one. Her loyal officers and inconvenient passengers dealt with at sea, her name becoming a different kind of mystery, a fine new flagship that simply never arrived. The Coral, indifferent, wrote another story instead. And pause, last of all in this slow return, at the islands, because the islands are the story's true stage and they reward a closer look than the weight of their history usually allows. The Houtman Abrolhos lie in three main groups strung north to south across some 50 miles of ocean. The Wallaby Group, where the Batavia struck, the Easter Group, and the Pelsiot Group to the south, named in time for the man whose journal fixed them in history. They are not tropical islands of the postcard kind. They are the exposed crests of coral platforms standing on the edge of the continental shelf, washed by the warm Lewin current flowing down from the north, which is why coral grows there at all, farther south than coral has much right to grow. The land they offer is coral shingle and limestone, saltbush and low scrub, nowhere rising more than a few yards above the tide, and the sound of them, day and night, is the sound that filled every hour of the castaways' lives. The steady white roar of ocean swell breaking on the outer reefs, a sound that never varies and never stops. The sea's own held breath. Seabirds own the air, shearwaters, noddies, terns in their tens of thousands, and sea lions haul out on the shingle, and beneath the surface, the islands are one of the richest meetings of tropical and temperate life in any ocean, which is why the crayfishermen came, and why the pearlers and guano diggers came before them. To the people of the Batavia, standing on Beacon Island in June of 1629, all this richness presented itself as a riddle with one cruel answer missing: everything but water. It rains in the Abrolhos winter, squalls sweeping through with the fronts, and rain saved them in the first weeks. But no stream, no spring, no pool of standing fresh water exists on the low islands at all. And the castaways' first industry, before any of the darkness began, was the catching of rain in spread sails and the husbanding of it in salvaged casks. A whole society's future measured in inches at the bottom of a barrel. It changes the reading of everything that followed to hold this in mind. The mutiny of Jeronimus Cornelis was conceived and carried out by men who were not starving, on islands that fed them adequately with fish and birds and sea lion meat, but who lived under a rationed sky and who had all, in the first days before the rain came, watched people die of thirst. Scarcity did not cause what happened. The trials made that plain, and the arithmetic of supplies was always more pretext than reason. But scarcity opened the door, as it so often does, and what walked through was already waiting. The historians who have sat longest with this story tend to converge on the same unsettling observation, which is how recognizable it all is. Strip away the period dress, and the sequence on Batavia's graveyard follows a pattern the modern world has documented in famine sieges and failed states, and behind more recent wires. The charismatic authority with a doctrine that licenses everything. The inner circle bound by oaths and shared acts that cut off retreat. The graded recruitment of ordinary men, each asked first for small complicities and then for larger ones, until the unthinkable has become the routine. The administrative language, lists and counsels and sentences, laid over the plain fact of murder. And opposite it, always smaller than one would hope, and never entirely absent, the refusal, the men who slipped across the channel to Hayes, the French soldiers who handed over the letters of temptation unread of profit, the private who built walls instead of joining. Jeronimus Cornelis has been examined by 4 centuries of readers, and by modern writers with the vocabulary of psychology at hand, and he remains what he was to Pelsiot's court, a man perfectly lucid and perfectly certain, without any discoverable remorse, persuasive to the last hour of his life. The age called it godlessness, The present reaches for its clinical words, and both vocabularies circle the same still center without entirely entering it. It is one of the reasons the story endures. It offers no comfortable species of villain, no madness that would place him safely outside humanity. Only a set of choices, made by a clever and injured and unlucky man, each one slightly darker than the last, in a place where nothing pushed back. And it offers Weber Hayes, about whom history knows almost nothing except the only things that matter, that he was given the worst assignment on the islands and turned it into salvation, that men trusted him without being made to, that he fought a defensive war for weeks without answering atrocity with atrocity, and that, when the moment came, he rode faster than treachery could. The story keeps its balance on those two figures, the merchant of death in scarlet and the sergeant of the stone walls. And every generation that retells it is quietly asking which of the two the ordinary human heart sits nearer, and quietly hoping it already knows. Somewhere between them stand all the others, the 100 or more who did neither, who kept their heads down on the graveyard island and lived or did not by luck and silence. And the honest reader spares them judgment, because the honest reader cannot be sure of doing better. The predicant's surviving letter says as much in its old, crowded Dutch, grief laid against grief. And yet, he writes, and the phrase recurs like a tide, and yet God's mercy, and yet we live, a man rebuilding the floor of the world, one sentence at a time. 4 centuries on, his letter is held in an archive, acid-free and climate-controlled, and scholars turn its pages with cotton gloves. And yet still does its work on everyone who reads it. There are threads of this story that run on past its ending, and following a few of them out is its own kind of rest. Consider the problem that put the ship on the reef, the problem of longitude, because the Batavia was one casualty in a very long war between seafarers and the shape of the earth. For as long as ships had ventured out of sight of land, the east and west of their position had been a matter of educated guessing, and the toll of that guessing, wrecks, vanishings, whole fleets lost on coasts their captains believed were days away, mounted through the 1600s until governments began offering fortunes for a solution. The answer, everyone understood in principle, was time. The earth turns at a fixed rate, so a navigator who knew the exact hour at his home port and compared it with local noon could compute how far around the world he had come. What no one possessed was a clock that could keep home time faithfully on a pitching, damp, hot and cold ship for months on end. And the pendulum clocks of Cornelis's era lost their minds within an hour of leaving harbour. The solution took another 100 years to arrive, in the workshop of an English carpenter's son named John Harrison, whose sea watches finally, in the 1760s, carried time across oceans intact, and with them the ability to fix a ship's place within a handful of miles. The technique reached general use late in that century, which is one reason the story of long-range navigation divides so cleanly into a before and an after. The Batavia, the Vergulde Drake, the Zuidorp, the Zeewijk, all belong to the before, to the age when every landfall was partly an act of faith, and the charts of the world were annotated, in effect, with the positions of the ships that had found their errors the hard way. It lends the old wrecks a particular poignancy. They were not lost through carelessness, most of them, but through the ordinary practice of the best method that existed, and their bones on the reefs of the Southland are markers in the long, slow, expensive process by which the human species learned where it was. Consider, too, the strangeness of what the Dutch did and did not do with the continent their ships kept striking. Between the first sighting in 1616 and the end of that century, Dutch navigators charted in pieces the western and northern and southern edges of Australia, named it New Holland, landed on it, described it, and buried men in it, and the company examined all these reports with its accountant's eye and concluded, correctly by its own lights, that the dry western coast offered no spices, no silks, no ports, and no profit, and therefore no reason to stay. So the greatest maritime power of the age held the map of a continent in its hands for most of a century and set it down again. And the land waited, its own peoples living their tens of thousands of years of history along its shores, until ships of another nation came into the east coast's kinder country 140 years after the Batavia broke on its western reefs. The two Dutchmen marooned near the Murchison River mouth in 1629 stand at the head of that strange non-history, Europe's first residents of a continent Europe declined. And along the western coast, in the accounts of later expeditions and in the oral traditions and genetic threads studied in recent times, there flicker unresolved suggestions of what may have become of them and of other castaways. Sailors' features remarked in coastal communities, Dutch-sounding words reported in local languages, none of it ever hardening into proof, all of it keeping the door of the story ajar. Consider the objects, because objects are how a wreck speaks. The silver that the Gujarati divers raised in 1629 went back into the company's bloodstream and vanished into commerce, but the wreck kept a remnant, and the excavations of the 1970s brought up coins by the thousand, pieces of 8 from the mints of Spanish America and thalers of the German lands, spread now through the museum cases of 2 hemispheres. Each disc of dulled silver, a small survivor of the arithmetic that sent the ship to sea. The great agate cameo, carved in the classical world and mounted for emperors, reached Java with Pelsert and continued its long career of outliving its owners. It survives today in a Dutch public collection, having passed through the wreck of the finest ship of its age, the way such objects pass through everything, unmarked. And in Fremantle, the humbler things hold the eye longest: the surgeon's mortar, the sounding leads, the carpenter's tools, the bearded stoneware jugs, and among them the small personal seals and buckles and thimbles that belonged to individuals, displayed a few inches from the reconstructed stern they sailed in, so that a visitor stands in a single room with the ship, her cargo, her furniture, and in the respectful adjacent galleries where the recovered remains and their stories are presented, with her people. Museums are sometimes accused of taming the past, but the Batavia Gallery does something nearer the opposite. The tall black timbers rise in the quiet like the instrument of the story they carried, and the visitors, whatever they came in talking about, go quiet too. The sea, for its part, has long since finished its own exhibition. On Morning Reef today, the excavation's traces have softened back into the coral, and the site, protected by law and by distance, is marked and monitored and mostly left to the surge. Anchors and cannon too great to raise lie where they fell, furred deep in growth, ranged by wrasse and coral trout. And the reef goes on doing what reefs do, building itself slowly out of sunlight and lime over the imprint of the ship, as it was doing before she came and will be doing long after. The last book about her is out of print. Divers who visit describe the same impression, that nothing about the place acknowledges its history at all. The water bright, the coral working, the swell passing overhead in slow silver ceilings, and that the peace of it is not an irony, but simply the truth of the sea, which holds no grudges and keeps no anniversaries, and which took the Batavia neither in anger nor in judgment, but in the plain course of physics, one hull, one reef, one tide. A few last figures ask to be followed a little further, before the lamp is lowered, because this chronicle has tried, all along, to give each person their moment, and some of the moments come only at the very end. There is Terentius, the painter whose ideas shadowed Cornelis out of Haarlem, and his afterword is stranger than fiction would dare. Broken by his interrogation and sentenced to 20 years, he was, within a few years, quietly released at the request of an unlikely admirer, the King of England, who esteemed his art, and he crossed the sea to work at the English court and later returned to the Netherlands and died in Amsterdam, an old and diminished man. Of all his paintings, praised in his lifetime as near miraculous, exactly one is known to survive. A small still life of pewter and glass and a bridle, hanging today in the Rijksmuseum, its surface so smooth that no one has ever fully explained his technique. A single sealed message from the mind whose echoes travelled on the Batavia. There is Jan Pelgrom de Bij, the ship's boy spared the gallows for his youth and marooned with Waterloos. And it is worth sitting one more moment with him, because he was 17 or 18, and the record of the islands shows him pitiable and dreadful at once. A boy caught up wholly in the doctrine and the pageantry of the mutiny, begging at the end for his life, and receiving instead a beach, a companion he barely knew, and a continent. Whatever the sand and the seasons did with him afterward, he had already become something the story cannot put down. The reminder that the mutiny's instruments included children, and that the line between the graves and the gallows ran, in some cases, straight through an age when a person is still being made. There are the unnamed, always the unnamed, the greater number in every ship's story of that age. The sailors whose entries in the muster roll are a name, a birthplace, and a wage. The soldiers listed only in count, the servants, the infants, the women recorded as wife of, daughter of. And this chronicle, which has spoken the recoverable names, closes its account of persons by acknowledging the rest. The majority of the Batavia's dead, whose faces no archive holds, and whose graves the coral kept without markers, and who are remembered now in the only way left, in the aggregate, by candlelight, in tellings like this one. And there is the ship, because in the tradition of this channel, the ship is a character to the last. She had lived as a working vessel less than 8 months. She had been, briefly, the finest thing her nation's shipwrights knew how to make, and the men who built her never learned what became of her. The news that returned to Amsterdam in 1630 was of loss and horror at the edge of the map, and the yard went on building, hull after hull, the way yards do. What the builders could not know, and what turns the story one final time toward the light, is that their work would be judged again 3.5 centuries later, by people bending over her raised timbers with instruments and reverence, and that the judgment would be admiration. The surviving stern section shows oak chosen and fitted with such care, double planking laid over close frames, that the archaeologists could read the whole grammar of Dutch shipbuilding from her bones, and much of what the world now knows about how the East Indiamen were actually made, as opposed to how the treatises said they should be made, it knows because the Batavia kept her side intact under the sand. The failed voyage becoming, in the very long run, the teaching ship of her whole vanished class. There is a kind of resurrection in that, quiet and technical and real, and the replica at Lelystad extends it. Young hands learned the old trades on her frames, the adze work, the caulking, the rigging of hemp, skills that had been 2 centuries dead, so that the ship that carried such darkness outward has carried on her second sailing through time mostly craft and curiosity and care. The accounts are not balanced by it. Nothing balances Batavia's graveyard, but the accounts of ships are never really closed, and hers, 400 years on, is still quietly acquiring entries on the credit side. The Abrolhos keep the rest. In the 2020s, around the 4th centenary of the wreck, the commemorations came and went, exhibitions in Fremantle and the Netherlands, new research published, descendants of survivors, for there are descendants, the predicant's daughter and Lucretia, and others carried the bloodlines on, gathering at the water. On the islands themselves, the anniversaries pass more simply. The winter fronts come through in June as they came in 1629, the squalls beating across Beacon Island and filling for an hour the hollows in the limestone of West Wallaby, and the shearwaters return to their burrows at dusk in their thousands, crying in the dark over the flats where the stone walls stand, and the swell breaks white on morning reef through every hour of every night, visible by moonlight, just as it was visible, for one moment, to a lookout whose warning was overruled, and the islands hold all of it with perfect indifference and perfect fidelity, the way the sea holds everything it is given. Every long voyage of this channel comes at last to its meditation, and the Batavia's asks for a gentler hand than most, because the usual consolations of shipwreck stories, the heroism of crews, the honest enmity of the storm, are only part of what she leaves behind. So let the meditation begin where the ship began, with ambition, because ambition is the deep keel of this whole history. The Batavia existed because a small nation of merchants decided that distance itself could be made into an asset, that a voyage of 8 months and 15,000 miles could be run on schedule, insured, capitalized, and repeated indefinitely. And the astonishing thing, the thing that the wrecks tend to obscure, is that they were right. The system worked decade upon decade, and the ships that arrived paid many times over for the ships that did not. But a system that works in the aggregate is still lived in the particular, one hull, one company of souls at a time, and the sea has never once dealt in aggregates. Every chart line the company drew was walked, in reality, by individual watchkeepers on individual nights, and the gap between the ledger in Amsterdam and the lookout at the masthead is where all these stories live. The gap where a corporation's calculated risk becomes, for 341 particular people, the entire and only world. The Batavia's people fell into that gap in the space of one glass of a middle watch. And what makes her story unlike the others, this channel tells, is what they found at the bottom of it, which was not only the sea. Most shipwreck chronicles are stories about nature, and this one, for all its coral and thirst, is finally a story about human arrangement, about how quickly the elaborate trellis of law and custom and rank that holds a society upright can be taken down when the society is small enough and far enough away, and how much of what any person calls their character is, in truth, held up by that trellis, by witnesses, by consequence, by the simple presence of a wider world. On Beacon Island, the wider world was withdrawn, wholly for more than 3 months, and the record of what followed is a kind of measurement, one of the very few controlled measurements history has ever taken, of what remains when everything external is removed. The reading it returned is not comfortable, and this channel has never pretended otherwise, but the reading is not simple either, because the same islands measured Weeby Hayes and his soldiers, and the refugees who risked the channel, and the French privates who could not be bought, and Lucretia Jans enduring toward a life she could not know was coming, and the predicant with his and yet, and the measurement of them stands in the same record, taken by the same instrument, under the same withdrawn sky. If the story of the mutiny shows how much of goodness is circumstance, the story of the defense shows how much of it, in some people, simply is not, and rests on nothing at all but the person, and holds. 4 centuries of readers have warmed themselves at that second finding, and there is no reason a listener drifting towards sleep tonight should not do the same. And then there is the sea itself, and time, the 2 great presences that this channel returns to at the close of every voyage. Because they are the presences that close every voyage, whether a channel notices or not. The sea took the Batavia without intention and kept her without malice, and what it did with her through the long custody is worth holding as a final image before the last image. It took a made thing, the proudest artifact of a wealthy civilization, and it unmade her slowly into materials, teak and oak into reef timber, iron into stain, and then, with no change of method, it began to preserve what it had unmade, sealing the fallen side under sand, growing its slow lime armor over the guns, keeping the coins bright in their concretions, so that destruction and preservation turned out to be the same patient process viewed at different depths, which may be the closest thing to a philosophy the ocean has ever offered. Time did the same with the story. It unmade the horror into rumor and the rumor into silence. And then, through the archive and the archaeologist, it began to give everything back, clearer than living memory had ever held it. The journals translated, the graves read, the faces reconstructed, until the people of the Batavia are now, in a strange and real sense, better known than they were in their own lifetimes, when they were only names on a muster roll of a company that thought in fleets. Nothing about the sea and time is kind, but nothing about them is cruel either. And there is rest in that, the deep, impartial rest of processes that hold no opinion of us at all, before which the worst of Beacon Island and the best of West Wallaby weigh the same and are kept the same, indefinitely, in salt and stone and paper. The listener who has come this far through the night has crossed with the ship the whole arc, the shipyard and the roadstead, the long blue running months, the whiteness on the water, the islands, the winter, the walls, the sail on the horizon, the gallows and the beach, the forgetting, the finding, the museum light on Old Oak. It is a heavier arc than most, and the channel has carried it as gently as truth allows. So let the ending be slow, and let it gather the story's quiet places one more time, the way a falling tide gathers the light. In Fremantle, the museum closes in the evening, and the last visitors move through the Batavia gallery toward the doors, and behind them the lights come down over the black timbers of the stern, and the ship stands in the dimness as she stands all night, every night, upright at last, 60 feet of oak that grew in German forests when the Middle Ages were barely over, holding in her grain the shipyard hammers, the ocean miles, the coral centuries, and the patient decades of conservators. And beside her the sandstone portico stands open on its patch of gallery floor, a doorway with no wall around it, leading, if it leads anywhere, only into the story. In Lelystad, the replica lies at her wharf in the North Sea dusk, her rigging drawing its old lines against a sky that Rembrandt would have recognized. And the water she floats on was seabed in her original's day, so that even the geography around her second life is a kind of resurrection, land raised from the sea by the descendants of the people the sea took. In an archive in The Hague, Pelsayert's journal sleeps in its climate-controlled dark, the ink of 1629 still legible where a tired, ill, careful man wrote down the courses and the depositions and the sentences, believing correctly that the writing was the only part of him that would arrive intact at the future. In Leiden, somewhere under the old city's stones, Lucretia Jans lies in a grave whose exact place is lost, having outlived everyone who wronged her. And far around the curve of the earth, in the eye of the southern winter, the Houtman Abrolhos lie out on the edge of the shelf in the long swell, the fishermen's boats gone to their moorings, the shearwaters home in their burrows, the little fort of coral slabs standing black against the star fields of a hemisphere. The men who built it had crossed the world to sea, and off the northern islands, under the moving silver ceiling of the swell, Morning Reef holds the last of her, the anchors, the ballast, the shapes under the coral, 40 feet down in clean water, where the surge passes over everything in a slow rhythm, all night, every night, the sea breathing over the place where the Batavia's voyage ended, and where, in every way that matters to the deep, nothing at all has ever happened. She was the pride of her fleet, and she sailed one voyage, and the voyage became a mirror that 4 centuries have looked into and not yet finished reading. The sea keeps the reef, the islands keep the graves and the walls, the archives keep the names, and the night, which has been listening all this while, keeps the story now, folded in with all the others, the Franklin ice and the whale-struck Essex, the drifting Mary Celeste, the long wakes of all the lost, one more voyage carried safely into the quiet. If these unhurried journeys into the deep past bring you calm at the day's end, you are gently invited to subscribe and to find, on this channel, the many other lost voyages waiting in the dark to be told. And for tonight, there is nothing more that needs to be known, and nowhere further that needs to be sailed. The watch below is yours. Sleep well, and let the long swell of the story carry you the rest of the way down into rest, as the sea carries everything, slowly, and holds it and keeps it safe.